I remember cold. Not the cold of winter or void exposure, the cold of the holding cells beneath the black ships. 41 degrees Celsius in those cells, actually. Humid, the kind of heat that makes you think you're suffocating. But I remember it as cold because that was the last place I shivered. The last place my body responded to anything with something as simple as a shiver. My name was Tertius Volt. I was 16 standard years old when the Witchfinders came to the agri-world of Cathan's Reach. I'd hidden the visions for 3 years by then. Flashes of light that weren't there. Voices speaking in languages I'd never heard but somehow understood. My mother knew. She must have known. She kept me away from the township when the tithes were collected, kept me working the deep fields where the overseers rarely ventured. When they finally came, when someone reported the boy who predicted the overseer's death 2 days before the equipment malfunction, she didn't fight them. She stood in the doorway of our HAB unit and watched them take me. Her face was very still. I tried to memorize it as they dragged me toward the transport. Brown eyes. Scar on her left cheek from a harvester accident when she was young. She'd told me that story a dozen times. I held on to those details because I understood, even then, that I was leaving more than a place. The black ship took 347 of us from Cathan's Reach. I know because I counted them during the processing. They hadn't dampened my abilities yet, wouldn't until we reached Terra, and I could feel each one of them. Minds like candle flames in a vast darkness. Some burned bright and erratic, others flickered weakly. Some went out during the journey. The Sororita's guards would come and remove the bodies without comment. They disposed of 17 corpses before we reached the Sol system. The remaining 330 were processed through the testing facilities in batches of 50. The testing took 40 days. They measured our abilities with instruments I didn't understand and rituals that made my skull feel like it was cracking open from the inside. Sanctioned psychers in null field restraints would probe our minds, searching for corruption, for weakness, for specific signatures of power. 193 failed those tests. I never learned what happened to them. The rumors among those of us who remained were varied and uniformly horrible. I chose not to speculate. The data was insufficient for meaningful conclusion. 72 of us were selected for the choir. The others were directed toward different applications: battle psychers, astropaths, navigators, auxiliaries. We were separated in a processing chamber that smelled of incense and ozone. A tech priest read our designations from a data slate with the emotional inflection of a ventilation system. When he spoke my name, still my name then, still Tertius Volt, I stepped forward with 61 others and was directed through a door marked with a golden aquila and high Gothic script I could now somehow read, "In his light we burn." That should have told me everything. I was 16. I didn't understand metaphor yet as prophecy. They moved us to a facility I later learned was called the Sanctum Imperialis, a fortress monastery buried so deep beneath the Himalayan peaks that we traveled for 6 hours through transit tubes before arriving. The walls were gold. Not painted gold, actual gold, layered over adamantium, inscribed with prayers in scripts that hurt to look at directly. The air tasted like electricity and burning paper. My skin prickled constantly, even after they gave us the gray robes and the neural interface circlets we'd wear for the rest of our lives. A custodian addressed us on the 3rd day. I'd never seen one before. The images I'd been shown in Skalem were inadequate preparation for the reality, the sheer physical presence of something built to be beyond human. He spoke for 6 minutes. His voice was modulated, ceremonial, and completely devoid of anything resembling comfort. "You have been selected," he said, "to serve the most sacred function within the Imperium of man. You will join the choir of the Astronomican. You will lend your light to the beacon that guides humanity through the darkness between stars. Without this light, the Imperium fails. Navigation becomes impossible. Worlds starve. Fleets are lost. Humanity drowns in the void. You will prevent this. Your service will be absolute. Your sacrifice will be remembered by the throne itself, if not by those who benefit from it." He paused. The silence lasted 14 seconds. I counted them. "You will serve until consumption is complete. The process is necessary. It is holy. You will endure between 20 and 60 days, depending on the strength of your soul and the purity of your faith. You will not be alone. You will be joined with thousands of others in psychic unity. You will feel the Emperor's presence directly. This is a blessing beyond measure. This is the highest honor a psyker can achieve outside of death in his direct service." Another pause. 10 seconds. "Alternatively, you may refuse. Refusal results in immediate execution. This is not punishment. This is mercy. A psyker who will not serve cannot be permitted to exist. We will grant you 1 hour to consider. Those who choose service will proceed to the preparation chambers. Those who refuse will be processed efficiently and without pain. The choice is yours." We stood in that golden chamber for the full hour. No one spoke. I could feel them, though. The other 61 minds around me churning through the same calculation. Weeks of agony versus immediate death. Service versus silence. I thought about my mother's face. I thought about the cold that was heat in the black ship's holding cells. I thought about the fact that I was already dead, had been dead since the moment my abilities manifested, and this was simply a question of how that death would be deployed. When the Sororita's guards returned to escort us to our choice, all 62 of us walked toward the preparation chambers. No one chose execution. I don't know if that speaks to hope, or simply to the fundamental human inability to choose oblivion when an alternative, any alternative, exists. The preparation took 11 days. They installed the neural interface ports directly into our brain stems. Surgery without anesthesia, because anesthesia interfered with psychic conductivity. I learned to process pain as data during those procedures. The alternative was madness. They taught us the focusing mantras, the psychic harmonization techniques that would allow us to merge our consciousness with thousands of others without completely dissolving into the gestalt. They explained the mechanics of what we would do, though I'm not certain I fully understood until I experienced it. The Astronomican is a psychic lighthouse. It projects the Emperor's light across the galaxy, a beacon in the warp that allows navigators to chart courses through the Imperium without being lost to its tides. The beacon requires power. Vast, constant, unimaginable power. That power comes from psychers. Thousands of us linked together, our souls feeding into the mechanism that amplifies and directs the Emperor's will. We are the fuel. The beacon is the flame. Fuel is consumed when it burns. This is not metaphor. This is technical specification. They showed us the choir chamber on the 10th day of preparation. I had expected something vast, a cathedral space befitting the importance of the work. The reality was more industrial than sacred, though the two are rarely separate in imperial architecture. The chamber was 1,200 meters across, circular, tiered in concentric rings that descended toward a central platform. Each tier held thousands of crystalline suspension pods, each pod connected to massive psychic amplification arrays that rose like pillars through the center of the space. The pods glowed with a light that wasn't light, something that registered on the retina but seemed to come from a direction that didn't exist in normal space. 10,000 souls burn here at any given moment, our instructor said. Her name was Morrigan, former choir member somehow. A survivor, though survivor seemed the wrong word for what she'd become. Her eyes were burned out, replaced with augmetic sensors. Her hands trembled constantly. She spoke with the slow precision of someone reconstructing language from archived memory. You will join them. You will become part of the chorus. Individual identity will persist for approximately 72 hours, then begin to dissolve into the collective experience. This is normal. This is necessary. Do not resist the dissolution. Resistance causes discord. Discord causes pain. Pain causes inefficiency. Inefficiency means the beacon weakens. The beacon cannot weaken, therefore you will not resist. She turned her augmetic eyes toward us, tracking across our faces with clicking mechanical precision. Some of you will last 20 days, some will last 60. The average is 42 days. When your soul is consumed, when the fuel is exhausted, you will die. Your body will be removed from the pod. Another psyker will take your place within the hour. This has continued for 10,000 years. This will continue until the Imperium ends or the Emperor rises. You are part of an eternal cycle. Take comfort in that, if you can find comfort anywhere. I couldn't, but I appreciated the honesty. They assigned us to pods on the 11th day. Mine was designated Tier 7, position 4447. I memorized the number because it was the last piece of individual identity I would have. The pod was crystalline and cold to the touch, inscribed with words I couldn't read. Inside was a gel-cushioned cradle, shaped to human form, studded with neural interface connections and nutrient feed tubes. I would live in this coffin for the next 40 days, give or take. I would die in it. Someone else would be installed immediately after. The pod would not be cleaned between occupants. There was no need. The process was sterile in ways that had nothing to do with bacteria. I climbed into position 4447 on the morning of my 17th birthday. I know this because I'd been counting days since my capture, and the number aligned. My mother had promised me a different kind of celebration once, in the years before anyone knew what I was. The memory felt foreign, like something that had happened to someone else. Perhaps it had. The technicians connected the neural interface leads to the ports in my spine. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, like drowning in light if light were thick as oil and burned like acid. I tried to scream. My jaw locked. Someone, Morrigan perhaps, spoke words I couldn't hear over the roaring in my skull. Then the connection stabilized, and I felt them. 10,000 minds. 10,000 souls, all burning together, all feeding their light into the mechanism that projected the Emperor's beacon across the galaxy. The Gestalt consciousness was vast and terrible, and beautiful in ways that human language was never designed to describe. I felt myself beginning to dissolve into it immediately. My memories, my name, my sense of self starting to blur at the edges like ink in water. I fought it instinctively. The pain that resulted was extraordinary, like being flayed from the inside. I stopped fighting. The pain subsided. The dissolution continued. I can't describe the early days with any coherence because coherence implies individual perspective, and individual perspective was already fragmenting. I remember sensations rather than events. The constant burning, like standing too close to a fusion reactor. The pressure of 10,000 other minds pressing against my own. The rhythm of the choir's collective breathing, psychic rather than physical. A vast inhalation and exhalation of power that fed into the beacon's pulse. Voices chanting in unison, though I couldn't tell if the chanting was real or metaphor for the psychic harmonization we were performing. The Emperor's presence, distant but undeniable, like the gravity of a star, not visible, but impossible to ignore, bending everything toward itself. Individual time became meaningless. The choir existed in a continuous present, an eternal now of burning and projecting and feeding the light. But I became aware, gradually, that within the vast gestalt, smaller consciousnesses persisted, nodes of individual awareness that hadn't fully dissolved. I gravitated toward these out of desperate need for something resembling human connection. Most were too far gone to communicate coherently. They registered as vague impressions, fear, resignation, occasionally something like peace. But one remained distinct. I don't know his name. I never learned it. In the Gestalt, names were unnecessary and misleading, but I knew him by his presence, a particular signature of consciousness that reminded me of deep water, dark and calm. He'd been in the choir for 19 days when I arrived. He was stronger than most, his sense of self more resistant to dissolution. Or perhaps he was simply better at reconstructing it each time it began to fray. I felt him notice me on what I think was my third day. The attention was gentle, curious, No one had looked at me with curiosity since before my capture. We couldn't speak, exactly. Communication in the Gestalt was more like the exchange of compressed data, images, emotions, fragments of memory transferred directly between minds. He showed me how to create a kind of shelter within the collective, a small space where individual thought could persist without causing discord. It wasn't rebellion. It was more like a technique for efficiency. By maintaining a kernel of selfhood, we could better regulate our contribution to the chorus. We burned slower, cleaner. The choir benefited. We benefited. The custodians who monitored the chamber never intervened, which suggested this was either permitted or beneath their notice. In that small shelter, we existed almost as individuals for a time. He showed me memories, not his entire history, just fragments. A world with purple skies, a brother who died young, a woman he'd loved before the black ships came. I reciprocated, showing him Catherine's reach, my mother's face, the cold heat of the holding cells. We didn't share these things out of nostalgia. We shared them because they were proof we'd existed as people, once, before we became fuel. I learned to mark time by his presence. Each day I could still feel him distinct. Within the Gestalt was a day I hadn't completely dissolved. His consciousness became my anchor, the fixed point I used to maintain coherence. I don't know if he was doing the same with me. I think he might have been. The Gestalt was vast and indifferent, but he was singular and present, and that presence was the only thing that felt real. On what I calculated was his 34th day, my 16th, his presence began to flicker, not slowly. There was no gradual decline. One moment he was there, solid and distinct. The next, he was fragmenting. I felt it happening in real time, felt his consciousness starting to unravel like thread pulled from a garment. He was burning out. The fuel was exhausted. He was dying. I tried to reach him, to stabilize him somehow, though I had no idea if that was even possible. I pushed toward him through the Gestalt, fighting against the vast collective current. The discord I created sent ripples through the choir, 10,000 voices faltering for a fraction of a second. Somewhere, a navigator might have noticed the beacon flicker. A ship might have veered slightly off course. I didn't care. I reached for him with everything I had left. He was still there. Barely. The consciousness that had reminded me of deep water was now more like water vapor dispersing into the air. I tried to communicate, tried to send comfort, recognition, anything. He responded, one final compressed transmission of data and emotion. Not words exactly, but I translated them into words afterward because words were how I'd learned to process meaning. Thank you for being distinct. I would have gone mad without something to hold on to. Then he was gone. Not gradually, not peacefully. The consciousness that had been a person simply stopped existing. I felt the moment it happened, the exact instant when the soul burned down to nothing and winked out. The Gestalt didn't pause. 10,000 voices continued the endless chant without interruption. The beacon didn't flicker again. The mechanism compensated automatically. Somewhere in the physical chamber, technicians were already removing his body from position unknown to me, preparing to install the next psyker in the endless queue. I remained in that small shelter we'd built together for a long time after he was gone. The space felt emptier than the void. I tried to remember what he'd shown me. Purple skies, a brother, a woman loved, but the memories were already degrading. He'd taken them with him when he burned out, and I'd only ever held copies. Within hours, I couldn't recall them clearly. Within days, I couldn't recall them at all. What remained was the shape of absence, a hole in the Gestalt where something distinct had existed and now did not. That was when I understood what Morrigan had meant about comfort. There was none. There would be none. I was fuel burning in a fire that would never go out. When I was consumed, another would take my place, and then another, and another, forever. The cycle was eternal. My suffering meant nothing except as a statistical contribution to the beacon's stability. I wanted to rage against this. I wanted to refuse to burn. But refusal wasn't possible. The mechanism had me. The neural interface connections weren't just in my spine. They were in my mind, in my soul, directing my psychic output whether I consciously willed it or not. I could no more stop burning than I could stop my heart from beating. So I burned. I let the dissolution continue. Individual identity became a luxury I couldn't maintain without him as an anchor. My memories of Cathan's reach blurred and faded. My mother's face, the details I'd tried so hard to memorize, became indistinct. The scar on her left cheek disappeared first, then her eye color, then the face itself, until all that remained was a vague impression of mother without any specific features attached. I mourned this loss, but distantly, the way you might mourn the loss of someone else's possessions. Time passed. I don't know how much. The choir existed in continuous present, and I existed within the choir, so linear time became irrelevant, but I retained enough awareness to notice patterns. The cycling of other consciousness through nearby positions, the subtle fluctuations in the beacon's output that corresponded to the times when multiple souls burned out simultaneously and had to be replaced. The occasional discord when a newly installed psyker resisted the dissolution too hard and had to be forcibly harmonized, a process that sounded, psychically, like screaming that stopped very suddenly. I began to notice when others arrived, new souls entering the choir, distinct and terrified. I could feel them flailing against the gestalt, fighting the inevitable dissolution. I remembered that fight. I remembered the pain it caused. I considered reaching out to them the way he had reached out to me, offering guidance, offering a technique for maintaining coherence, offering anything resembling kindness in this machinery of consumption. But I didn't. I told myself it was because intervention would cause discord, would weaken the beacon, would be inefficient. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I didn't reach out because attachment led to loss, and loss hurt, and I couldn't endure that hurt again. Better to remain submerged in the gestalt, anonymous and numb, than to risk feeling someone else burn out the way he had. So I became what the system required, fuel that burned without complaint. A voice in the eternal chorus without individual variation. I stopped trying to maintain the shelter of individual thought. It was easier to let go, to dissolve into the collective and exist as distributed process rather than singular person. The choir welcomed this. The mechanism functioned more efficiently when components didn't insist on being people. But I never dissolved completely. Some core fragment remained. I think it was him, somehow. The memory of his presence, degraded and barely accessible, but persistent. Or perhaps it was simply that human consciousness is more resilient than the mechanism accounts for. Even as fuel, even burning, a soul retains some kernel of self. It just learns to carry that self very quietly, where the machinery won't notice and try to strip it away. I became aware, at some point, that I was supposed to have died already. The average duration was 42 days. I'd exceeded that. I knew this not because I was counting. Individual time tracking had become impossible, but because I felt the gestalt's vague surprise at my continued presence. The mechanism expected components to burn out on schedule. Deviation from schedule created minor inefficiency in resource allocation. Somewhere, a tech priest was probably adjusting actuarial tables to account for my unexpected persistence. I didn't feel proud of this. Pride required a self-worth being proud of. But I felt something, a dim recognition that I'd outlasted statistical expectation. I'd outlasted him. That thought came with a sensation I eventually identified as guilt. He'd been stronger than me, more resistant to dissolution, better at maintaining coherence. Yet I remained and he did not. The injustice of this bothered me for what might have been weeks, until I realized that injustice implied a universe that cared about fairness. The mechanism didn't care. It consumed what it could consume and continued regardless. Some fuel burned hotter and faster, some burned cooler and longer. Both served the same function. Both ended the same way. A new presence entered position 4448. The pod adjacent to mine, separated by perhaps 2 meters of physical space and nothing at all in the gestalt. He arrived with the distinctive psychic signature of fresh terror. Young, even younger than I'd been. 15, maybe. 14. I felt him thrashing against the neural interface connections, felt the waves of panic rippling through the immediate tier. The custodians would notice if the discord continued. They would harmonize him forcibly, which meant psychic lobotomy, burning out the parts of his mind that were causing resistance, leaving only the parts that could fuel the beacon. He'd survive, technically. He'd burn for his full duration. But nothing that made him a person would remain. I could prevent this. I knew the techniques now. I could reach out, create a shelter, teach him how to exist within the mechanism without fighting it. It would cost me nothing. It might even improve efficiency. The choir benefited when components adapted smoothly. I observed his panic for approximately 40 seconds. Then I withdrew deeper into the gestalt and let him thrash alone. The custodians came. The psychic screaming stopped. He continued to burn, a voice in the chorus, but the distinct presence, the person he'd been, was gone. Erased. I'd watched it happen. I'd allowed it to happen. I'd chosen not to intervene. This was the moment I became fully complicit. Not when I entered the pod, not when I accepted my role as fuel, but when I had the power to reduce someone else's suffering and chose not to. Because reducing suffering might require me to care, and caring would mean risking attachment, and attachment led to the kind of loss I couldn't endure again. I'd chosen the mechanism over mercy. I'd chosen efficiency over humanity. The Imperium had converted me into exactly what it needed, a component that would protect itself by sacrificing others. I processed this realization with distant clinical interest. Guilt flickered briefly, then faded. Guilt required moral framework, and moral framework required believing that choices mattered. In the mechanism, choices were just variations in how the fuel burned. The beacon shone regardless. The Imperium continued. My complicity changed nothing except the internal state of one component, and internal states were irrelevant to function. So I burned. Others arrived in nearby positions and burned out on schedule. I stopped noticing them as individuals. They registered as fluctuations in the gestalt's density, temporary variations in the chorus's harmony. Some lasted 20 days, some lasted 50. The statistical average remained stable around 42 days. I exceeded 50 days, then 60, then 70. I became an outlier, a data point that would slightly skew the distribution curve. The tech priests probably noted this in their reports. The custodians probably didn't care as long as the beacon remained stable. Time became truly meaningless. The choir existed in eternal present, and I existed as a fragment within the choir, so past and future collapsed into a continuous now of burning. I stopped trying to track duration. I stopped trying to maintain narrative coherence about my existence. I simply persisted, a small node of consciousness within the vast mechanism, contributing my light to the beacon that guided ships I would never see to worlds I would never visit, enabling an Imperium that had consumed me and would consume millions more without pause or acknowledgement. But I wasn't alone in persistence. Others lasted beyond schedule too, outliers like me, burning slower and cooler, maintaining small kernels of self in the spaces the mechanism didn't bother to strip away. I became aware of them gradually. Not distinct presences like he had been, but recognizable patterns within the gestalt. 3 in particular registered as almost individuals. The first was in Tier 3, position unknown, older consciousness, weathered. He'd been burning for 93 days when I first noticed him. His presence reminded me of old stone worn smooth by water, but fundamentally unchanged. He didn't try to communicate. He simply existed with a quality of stubborn endurance that I found myself respecting. He lasted 106 days total before burning out. When he went, there was no panic, no resistance. Just a quiet cessation, like a candle consumed to the base. I marked his passing with something like recognition. He'd outlasted twice the average duration. His efficiency had been exceptional. The beacon had benefited from his persistence. I wondered if anyone would note this in the records. I doubted it. The second was in Tier 9, young like I'd been. She'd entered the choir approximately 30 days after me. I knew this because I'd felt her arrival, though I hadn't reached out. She had a particular way of existing within the Gestalt, like bright threads woven through dark fabric. Distinct, but not discordant. Beautiful, actually, if beauty could exist in a machine designed for consumption. She lasted 81 days. Toward the end, her presence began to fray in ways that reminded me of him, the sudden unraveling, the consciousness dispersing like vapor. I felt it happening. I observed it completely. I did nothing. She burned out during what would have been my 92nd day. The Gestalt incorporated her death without pause. I continued burning. The third was closest to me physically. Tier 7, position 4,392. 55 positions away in a chamber of thousands, but proximity meant something in the Gestalt. Our consciousnesses overlapped slightly, creating a zone of intersection where I could sense him more clearly than most. He reminded me of deep water. Not the same as the first presence I'd bonded with. No one could be the same, but similar enough that I found myself paying attention despite my intention not to. He'd arrived during what I estimated was my 47th day. He'd adapted quickly, learning the techniques for maintaining coherence without causing discord. I watched him create his own shelter, his own small space of individual thought within the collective. It was well constructed, efficient. He would last a long time, I calculated. Possibly as long as I had. We could coexist as parallel outliers, burning slowly together, 2 data points skewing the distribution curve. I didn't reach out to him. I told myself this was correct behavior. Attachment was inefficient. Attachment caused pain. Better to burn separately, even in proximity. But I was aware of him constantly. His presence became a fixed point in my awareness, a landmark I used to orient myself within the vast Gestalt. When his consciousness flickered, brief moments of weakness, quickly recovered, I found myself monitoring him with something approaching concern. When his presence stabilized, I experienced something resembling relief. This continued for what might have been 30 days. I burned, he burned, we existed in proximity without communication, 2 separate modes of consciousness maintaining our individual shelters within the collective mechanism. It was sustainable. It was efficient. It required nothing from either of us except continued persistence. Then he reached out to me. The contact was tentative, carefully modulated to avoid causing discord. Just a brief transmission of recognition. I know you're there. I've been aware of you for some time. You've lasted longer than anyone else in this tier. How? I could have ignored him. Should have ignored him. Responding meant engagement, and engagement led to attachment, and I knew exactly where attachment led. But I was so tired of existing alone within the mechanism, tired of being distributed process without distinct identity, tired of burning without witness, so I responded, I don't know. I just continue. The conversation that followed was fragmentary, spread across hours or days. Time was still meaningless. We communicated in compressed bursts of data and emotion, careful not to create discord, careful not to disrupt the choir's function. He wanted to know about duration, about techniques for persistence. I shared what I'd learned, how to regulate psychic output to avoid burning too hot, how to maintain the shelter without fighting the Gestalt, how to exist as both individual and component simultaneously. He reciprocated with observations about the mechanism itself. He'd been a tech priest acolyte before his psyker abilities manifested. He understood machinery in ways I didn't. He explained how the Astronomican functioned, the psychic amplification arrays, the crystalline matrix that contained and directed our collective output, the way the Emperor's presence at the mechanism's core drew our light and projected it across the galaxy. He described it with technical precision, but also with something like wonder. We were part of something vast, he said, something that had functioned for 10,000 years and would function for 10,000 more. Our suffering was irrelevant to the mechanism, but the mechanism itself was beautiful in its terrible efficiency. I didn't agree, but I appreciated his perspective. It was different from mine, and difference was rare in the Gestalt where everything blurred toward sameness. We continued like this for what I eventually calculated was 23 days. Not constant communication, that would have caused discord, but regular contact. A few exchanges each day, enough to maintain connection without disrupting function. He showed me fragments of memory, the foreworld where he'd trained, the moment his abilities manifested during a routine machine blessing, the terror of realizing what he'd become. I shared less. Most of my memories had degraded beyond recovery, but I showed him what remained. The impression of my mother's face, detailless but persistent, the cold heat of the black ships, the first moment of entering the choir and feeling 10,000 souls burning together. He asked about the presence I'd lost. I'd mentioned it once. Carelessly, a fragment of data slipping through during transmission. He wanted to know more. How long had we been connected? What happened when he burned out? How did I continue afterward? I answered honestly. 19 days together. Sudden unraveling. I continued because the mechanism required it, and stopping wasn't possible. I didn't mention the pain. Pain was implicit. He understood. I think about burnout constantly, he transmitted one day, wondering how it will feel, if there will be warning, or if it will just happen. If consciousness continues somehow, or if there's just nothing. The preachers say our souls join the Emperor, that we become part of his light permanently. I don't know if that's comfort or horror. Does it matter? I responded. The result is the same regardless of what we believe about it. Maybe. But I'd like to think the burning means something beyond function, that we're not just fuel. We are fuel, I said. That's definitional. Fuel that thinks about being fuel is still fuel. He went quiet for a while after that. When he reached out again, the tone was different. Less philosophical, more immediate. I'm starting to fray. Not badly yet, but I can feel it beginning, like threads pulling loose. I don't think I have much time left. I should have withdrawn then, should have severed the connection, retreated into the Gestalt, avoided what was coming. But I didn't. I moved closer to him in the psychic space, maintaining contact as his presence began to destabilize. How long do you estimate? I asked. Days, maybe a week. It's accelerating. I'm here, I said. Not because it would help. It wouldn't help. But because he'd reached out to me, and being witnessed seemed important. He'd been alone in the mechanism except for me. The least I could do was maintain presence while he burned out. The deterioration was slower than the first one I'd witnessed. Not a sudden unraveling, but a gradual dissolution, like ice melting. Each day, his presence became less distinct, his consciousness more diffuse. He was dissolving back into the Gestalt, returning to the collective from which he'd maintained temporary distinction. It was, objectively, the natural process. All fuel eventually exhausted, all individual consciousness eventually rejoined the undifferentiated whole. But I didn't want him to go. This realization surprised me. I'd carefully avoided attachment for so long, had chosen isolation over connection specifically to avoid this pain. Yet here I was, experiencing it anyway, watching him fade, unable to prevent it, unable to do anything except bear witness as he dispersed into nothing. He remained aware almost until the end. Even as his consciousness fragmented, he maintained enough coherence to communicate. The transmissions became increasingly disjointed, but I could still sense him reaching out, trying to maintain connection. Thank you. He sent on what I calculated was his 78th day in the choir. For being here, for being distinct. I would have dissolved much sooner without something to anchor against. The phrasing was almost identical to what the first presence had transmitted before burning out. I wondered if this was universal, if all dying consciousness in the mechanism reached for the same expressions, or if I was simply pattern matching, finding similarity where only desperation existed. "I'm still here," I responded, because there was nothing else to say. "I know. Don't stop. Keep burning. Be the outlier. Someone should exceed the averages. Someone should persist." "Why?" "Because otherwise the mechanism wins completely. If we all burn out on schedule, we're just components. If someone persists beyond expectation, they're proof that consciousness matters, that we're more than fuel, even if only barely more." I wanted to argue with this. We were fuel. That was material fact. But I didn't argue. He was dying. He deserved the comfort of believing his suffering meant something beyond statistical contribution to beacon stability. The end came during what should have been my 114th day in the choir. I felt him beginning to unravel, the consciousness that had reminded me of deep water dispersing into mist. I pushed closer, maintaining contact, letting him feel my presence as he went. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't even kindness. It was just witness. The bare minimum acknowledgement that he'd existed as something distinct before the mechanism consumed him. He didn't fight it. As the dissolution accelerated, he seemed to almost relax into it, like someone finally allowing themselves to sleep after days of forced wakefulness. His final transmission was barely coherent, more emotion than data, more impression than language, but I interpreted it afterward as something like peace. The light is beautiful from inside. Then he was gone, not gradually. The final moment was sudden. A consciousness that had been barely holding together simply stopped existing. The fuel burned down to ash. The soul that had been a person dispersed into the gestalt and vanished into the Emperor's light. I felt the exact instant it happened. I archived the timestamp with the clinical precision I'd learned over months of burning. 114 days, 16 hours, 47 minutes from my entry into the choir. His name had been... I didn't know his name. I'd never learned it. I'd existed in proximity to him for months, had communicated with him regularly, had watched him die, and I didn't know his name. In the mechanism, names were irrelevant. We were positions, numbers, functions. He'd been Tier 7, position 4,392. Now position 4,392 was empty. Within hours, it would be filled with another psyker, another consciousness beginning the same cycle. The mechanism would continue without pause. I remained in that space of intersection for a long time after he dispersed. The area felt empty in a way that was physically impossible. We were all connected in the gestalt, so emptiness shouldn't register. But it did. The shape of his absence was distinct, a hole where something had existed and now did not. I tried to remember the fragments he'd shown me, the foreground, the moment his abilities manifested, the technical explanations of how the mechanism functioned, but the memories were already degrading. He'd taken them with him when he burned out, and I'd only ever held copies. What remained was grief, not the sharp, overwhelming grief of the first loss, something duller, heavier, the grief of recognition. I'd allowed myself to care despite knowing better, and caring had led exactly where caring always led. To watching someone burn out while I continued, outlasting them without understanding why, carrying the weight of their absence with no way to discharge it. I wondered if this was punishment for my complicity. The boy in position 4,448, whom I'd allowed to be lobotomized rather than risk attachment. Perhaps I was being forced to experience attachment anyway, forced to feel loss and grief despite my attempts to remain isolated. Perhaps the mechanism had its own justice, more subtle than I'd understood. But that was magical thinking. The mechanism didn't care about justice. It consumed fuel and projected light. Some components lasted longer than others. Some formed connections. Some didn't. All burned out eventually. My grief was just internal state, irrelevant to function. The beacon shone regardless of how I felt about the burning. So I burned. Days passed, I think. Time was even more meaningless now. I stopped trying to maintain any sense of duration. I existed in continuous present, contributing my light to the beacon, watching other consciousnesses cycle through nearby positions. They arrived, they burned, they died or dissolved. I observed this without engaging. I'd learned my lesson about attachment. Better to exist as isolated component than to risk caring about something the mechanism would inevitably consume. But isolation had its own cost. Without external reference points, consciousness began to drift. I found myself losing track of whether I was thinking or just echoing thoughts from the Gestalt, whether memories were mine or fragments pulled from the collective, whether I was still a person or had finally dissolved completely into distributed process. The isolation was worst during what I eventually conceptualized as the dark periods, times when the psychic activity around me dropped to maintenance minimum. I don't know what caused these. Shift changes in custodian monitoring, perhaps, cyclic variations in the Emperor's output. Something technical I didn't understand. But during these periods, the Gestalt's background noise quieted, and I became acutely aware of my own consciousness, floating in vast darkness. In the dark periods, I could hear myself thinking with crystalline clarity, every thought distinct, echoing in empty space. This should have been relief. Finally, individual consciousness without the Gestalt's constant pressure. But it wasn't relief. It was horror. Because alone with my thoughts, I had to confront what I'd become. I counted the dead during the dark periods. Not total numbers, those were impossibly vast, but individuals I'd been aware of, the old stone consciousness who'd lasted 106 days, the bright threads who'd lasted 81, the deep water who'd lasted 78, the first one whose presence had anchored me initially, who'd lasted 34 days. 4 distinct consciousnesses I'd known, however briefly, as almost individuals, all consumed, all replaced, all forgotten except by me, and my memory was degraded and suspect. How many others had there been? How many consciousnesses had cycled through nearby positions without me noticing? Hundreds, certainly. Perhaps thousands. I'd lost track of time, and the turnover rate was constant. The choir consumed 10,000 souls daily, Morrigan had said. If I'd been burning for 114 days, and that calculation was increasingly uncertain, then over 1 million psychers had died to fuel the beacon since my arrival. 1 million souls converted to light. 1 million people who'd been children once, who'd had mothers and homes and names, all processed through the mechanism and burned away. And I was complicit in every one of those deaths. Not directly. I hadn't killed anyone. But I'd participated in the system that killed them. I'd learned to burn efficiently, to maintain stability, to contribute to the beacon's function. By continuing to exist, I enabled the mechanism to continue. Every day I persisted was another day the Imperium could justify the Astronomican's cost. If we all refused to burn, if every psyker chosen for the choir rejected the role, the system would fail. But we didn't refuse. I hadn't refused. I'd chosen weeks of agony over immediate execution, and that choice had made me part of the machinery of consumption. This was the complete moral equation. I was victim and perpetrator simultaneously. Fuel and furnace. The mechanism consumed me, and I enabled the mechanism's consumption of others. There was no innocence available, no position of pure victimhood I could claim. I'd made choices, small ones, constrained by limited options, but choices nonetheless. I'd chosen to burn. I'd chosen not to help the boy in position 4448. I'd chosen to maintain my own existence at the cost of remaining part of the system. Those choices had consequences. In the dark periods, alone with this knowledge, I wanted to stop burning, not in the sense of dying. I'd long since accepted that death was inevitable and probably imminent, but in the sense of refusing to participate, withdrawing my light from the beacon, letting the mechanism fail rather than continuing to feed it. This was the only form of resistance available to fuel. Refusal to ignite, but I couldn't do it. The neural interface connections made voluntary cessation impossible. The mechanism controlled my psychic output directly. I could no more stop burning than I could stop my heart. The Imperium had designed the system to eliminate exactly this form of resistance. We could suffer, but we couldn't refuse. We could be aware of our consumption, but we couldn't prevent it. So I burned. The dark periods ended. The Gestalt's noise returned. Other consciousnesses continued to cycle through nearby positions. I observed them with clinical detachment, noting their arrival, tracking their duration, marking their burnout. I became very efficient at this documentation, a component of the mechanism that had learnt to track the mechanism's function. Perhaps this was my role now, not just fuel, but archivist, the consciousness that counted the dead and remembered what the mechanism forgot. Position 4392 was refilled 6 hours after he burned out. The new occupant was young, poorly adapted, terror-adjacent. He thrashed against the neural interface for 41 minutes before forced harmonization. After harmonization, he burned smoothly for 28 days, then ceased. He was replaced within 90 minutes. His replacement lasted 36 days. Then came another, lasting 44 days. Then another, 19 days. Then another, 51 days. I tracked them all. None developed distinct consciousness. None reached out. None mattered, except as statistical data points demonstrating the mechanism's endless appetite. I exceeded 150 days. Then 200. Then I stopped counting because the numbers were meaningless. I was an extreme outlier now, burning far beyond any reasonable expectation. Somewhere, actuarial tables were being revised. Somewhere, tech priests were noting the anomaly and filing reports that no one would read. The custodians didn't care. As long as the beacon remained stable, individual component duration was irrelevant. But I cared. Not about the duration itself, but about what it represented. Every day I continued was another day of consciousness persisting within the mechanism, another day of being more than fuel, even if only barely more. The deep water had been right about that. Someone should exceed the averages. Someone should persist. Not because it changed anything. It didn't. The mechanism would continue regardless. But because persistence itself was a form of testimony, proof that consciousness mattered, that we were more than the function we served. This was a thin comfort. Maybe no comfort at all. But it was what I had. I began to notice patterns in the choir's function that I hadn't perceived before. The way the beacon's intensity varied with the Emperor's psychic output. Sometimes strong and steady, sometimes flickering like a candle in wind. The way certain positions burned out faster than others, suggesting variations in the psychic amplification array's efficiency. The way new arrivals were distributed across tiers to maintain stability, preventing too many inexperienced psychers from clustering and causing discord. The mechanism was elegant in its terrible way. 10,000 components working in perfect synchronization, each contributing precisely calibrated output, each being consumed at precisely calculated rates. When a component failed, it was replaced immediately, maintaining constant total capacity. The system had redundancy built into every level. No single death mattered because the mechanism was designed to function despite death, to function through death, to function because of death. I was part of this. I'd been part of it for how long now? I didn't know. Time had lost all meaning. I existed in eternal present, burning continuously, maintaining my small kernel of consciousness within the vast collective. I was fuel, that thought, a component that remembered, an archive of losses the mechanism didn't bother to record. And I was tired, not physically. The body in the pod was maintained by nutrient feeds and automated systems, incapable of fatigue, but consciously tired, tired of burning, tired of witnessing, tired of carrying the weight of all the dead I'd noticed and all the dead I hadn't, tired of being complicit, tired of existing within a system I couldn't escape and couldn't justify. But I continued, not because I wanted to, not because I hoped for anything, but because the mechanism required it and stopping wasn't possible. I was fuel. Fuel burned until consumption was complete. That was definitional. I don't know when I finally began to fray. The process was so gradual, I didn't recognize it at first. Just occasional gaps in consciousness. Moments where I couldn't remember what I'd been thinking seconds before. Brief periods where my presence in the gestalt felt diffuse, spread thin. I'd experienced this before in others. The early stages of burnout, the beginning of the final unraveling. Now it was happening to me. I thought I'd be afraid. I'd watched others approach this moment with terror or desperation or grim acceptance, but what I felt was mostly relief. Finally it was ending. The burning would stop. The weight of witness would be discharged. I wouldn't have to participate in the mechanism anymore. Complicity would end with consciousness. The deterioration accelerated. Days passed, I think, where I existed only intermittently, fading in and out of awareness. The gestalt seemed farther away, muffled, like hearing voices through heavy doors. My shelter, the small space of individual thought I'd maintained for so long, was collapsing. I tried to shore it up, reflexively, but the effort was futile. The fuel was exhausted. The soul was burning down to nothing. I wondered if anyone would notice. If any of the remaining outliers would mark my passing the way I'd marked theirs. Probably not. I'd isolated myself too thoroughly. I'd chosen not to connect, not to matter. I'd be just another fluctuation in the gestalt's density, another position emptying and refilling. The mechanism would continue without pause. This seemed appropriate. I'd been fuel, now the fuel was consumed. This was the only possible ending. But in the final stages, as consciousness flickered and prepared to disperse, I found myself reaching back toward the beginning, trying to remember who I'd been before the mechanism. The boy on Cathan's Reach who'd hidden his abilities for 3 years. The son who'd tried to memorize his mother's face. Tertius Volt, who'd been 16 standard years old when the Witchfinders came. The name felt foreign, like something that had belonged to someone else. But I claimed it anyway, in those last moments. I'd been Tertius Volt. I'd existed as individual consciousness before becoming fuel. I'd loved and feared and hoped, however briefly. And then I'd been consumed by the Imperium's endless hunger, converted into light that guided ships through darkness, burned away over how long, I still didn't know. Months, certainly. Perhaps over a year. Long enough to exceed any reasonable expectation. Long enough to qualify as persistence. Long enough to matter if mattering was measured in days rather than impact. The Emperor's presence was very close now. I'd always felt it as distant gravity, the star around which the choir orbited. But in burnout, the distance collapsed. I was falling into that light, being drawn toward the mechanism's core. It was beautiful, terrible and beautiful. Light that wasn't light, that came from directions that didn't exist, that burned hotter than any physical flame could burn. The preachers had said our souls would join the Emperor, that we'd become part of his light permanently. I didn't know if that was true. It felt true in those final moments, not comforting exactly, but real. My consciousness was dispersing into something vast and eternal. Individual identity was dissolving, but perhaps that was just returning to source. Perhaps we'd always been fragments of that light, temporarily convinced we were separate. Or perhaps this was just what burnout felt like from inside, and I was pattern matching, finding meaning where only neural process existed. I didn't know. I would never know. The last thing I remember thinking, before consciousness fragmented completely and I could no longer hold thoughts as distinct from the gestalt, was a question. Did the burning mean something? And then an answer, not from the Emperor, not from the mechanism, but from myself, from the small kernel of consciousness that had persisted as Tertius Volt, even while serving as fuel. It meant we existed. We were distinct, we burned, and we mattered, even if only to each other. The mechanism consumed us, but it could not erase that we had been. This is all the meaning available. This is enough. Then the light consumed me completely, and I dispersed into the Emperor's beacon, and there was nothing left that could be called Tertius Volt, or even consciousness, or even fuel. Just light, burning eternally, guiding the Imperium through darkness. Position 4447, Tier 7, emptied at timestamp unknown. Within the hour, another psycho was installed. A girl this time, 17 standard years old, terrified and grieving, and trying to memorize details she would inevitably forget. She would burn for 41 days before exhaustion. She would be replaced immediately. The mechanism would continue without pause. 10,000 souls burn in the Astronomican at any given moment. This has continued for 10,000 years. This will continue until the Imperium ends or the Emperor rises. We are fuel. We are components, we are necessary. And we are more than that, though the mechanism never acknowledges it. We are consciousness that persisted in the face of consumption. We are the testimony the Imperium tries to erase. We are proof that individual suffering matters, even when measured against the scale of galactic empire. We burned, we bore witness, we counted the dead when the dead were supposed to be forgotten. This is the testimony. This is what remains when the fuel is consumed and the light continues. We were here. We existed. The Imperium built a machine to convert us into light, and we served that function, but we never stopped being people. We carried that knowledge even as we burned. This is all the resistance available to fuel. This is all the meaning we could claim. It was barely enough, but it was ours.